Hi, my name's Stephen Magill, and I'm VP of Product Innovation at Sonatype. My background is in program analysis. I did my PhD in that area where I studied static analysis and built tools to find errors in software and improve the security of software. And I've continued to work in that area, but I've been getting more and more interested in the practice of building software and how developers approach that. So how they approach combining different components to create their software project, what tools they use in the development process, and the role that those choices and practices play in software development productivity and security. And one of the most exciting things I've been able to do over the last 3 years at this point is collaborate with others at Sonatype and with Gene Kim at IT Revolution on research in this area. We've taken a look at open source development practices as well as practices at enterprises when it comes to their use of open source. And we've analyzed that data for trends, best practices, and learnings that we can share with the community. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be giving an overview of the research we've done, and really it's going to be a grab bag of different results from various projects. So I hope you find it interesting, and please reach out to me in the chat if you have any questions. So the title of the talk today is the myth of productivity versus compliance and how to have it all. And the point here is, you don't have to choose, and we're going to get into why that is in a second. So I want to start with just the point that open source is really everywhere at this point. So Nat Friedman, CEO of GitHub, said 99% of new software projects include open source. And if you look at the data, often those applications are composed primarily of open source. 70% or so of open source is not uncommon. So how you're inviting essentially all these teams into your team, right? The software project now is not just developed by your team, it's developed by a whole suite of open source contributors. So you're inviting, in some cases, thousands of developers into your code when you use these open source components. And so how do you know if they're going to help you or if they're going to hurt security, right? It's sort of this double-edged sword. It can go both ways. Certainly, there's huge productivity, security advantages as well. Often open source libraries provide things like cryptography that really require expertise to get right, authentication, other sorts of distributed systems, all of this stuff. It's really valuable to have a best-in-class solution available to you for those things. But you want to make sure that you're picking the right solution and that you're attending to the security implications of including that in your code. So what we wanted to look at is which practices, when you look at these open source projects, which practices among these projects correspond to really good component security outcomes and therefore have a positive impact, not just on productivity and quality in your projects, but also security. So we looked across different ecosystems, decided to focus in on Java. Sonatype, as I mentioned, this was a collaboration with people at Sonatype. Sonatype runs the Maven Central repository, so we have some really great insight into the projects there, the communities, update behaviors, and so forth. There's great data sources on, dependencies, upgrade behaviors, and so forth. And so that's what we dug into first was, what do we see in the data when we look back across all this history of releases of a variety of the most popular open source projects. So we in particular wanted to see how do open source projects manage their supply chains. We talk a lot about supply chain security when it comes to enterprises. You have a business that's using open source, how do they secure that supply chain? But we have open source supply chains too, right? Most open source projects depend on other open source projects. So how do they manage that? But then also getting back to this enterprise question of how do they manage their supply chains and what practices correspond to good outcomes there. And then what does this tell us about really how the two sides should work together, right? How enterprise should participate in open source, how open source can better serve the enterprise, what learnings are there? So in terms of background, we started this particular work that I'll report on first in 2018, looking at that Maven Central data, seeing what it could teach us about component usage. By 2019, we had analyzed 310,000 open source projects. If you look at all the version releases of those projects, it's over 4 million different versions. And so we filtered through all that data, did some analysis, and at first focused on the consumer side, that's a focus on the producer side. Then we went and focused on the consumer side, looking at developers at companies that use open source and finding out what they report in terms of their usage. So I'll talk about all of this quickly, but first I'm going to focus in on this analysis of these open source projects and supply chains. So As I said, 310,000 components, 4.2 million versions. Almost 7,000 of those have associated GitHub repos, so we can get additional data by looking at the GitHub history and metadata associated with those repos. 27,000 of those, so 8.9% have known vulnerabilities. So, that's sort of the slice that you're looking at when it comes to security. And the question is, what leads to those? How can you predict, which of those components are going to be secure? And it's not, vulnerabilities happen, right? But it's really about how we respond to those. So how can you be sure that you're in a position where you can be responsive to security vulnerabilities that come out? All right, so as I mentioned, this is work from the State of the Software Supply Chain report, which is an annual report that Sonatype produces. I've been working with them on this report since 2019. So you can go see these first bit of results in the 2019 report. This was joint work with Gene Kim, also Bruce Mayhow and Ghazi Mohammed at Sonatype, Kevin Witten, Derek Wheats, and Matt Howard, also huge contributors to this. Thanks to everyone for pulling this together. There were a lot of people working on this project. So we started off by saying, what does better mean? So we want to analyze, better, what leads to better outcomes, what leads to worse outcomes, what do we mean by better? Well, first of all, we started approaching this by looking at, what better means in the enterprise, right? There's actually some great research studies. The State of DevOps reports, the DORA State of DevOps reports, Nicole Forsgren's work on those, as well as her and her team's work on the Accelerate book. Those are really great resources to go and look at for what leads to good outcomes in the enterprise. So we wanted to, sort of build on that work, those foundations of like, what is a good project, what practices and outcomes do we want to prioritize, and see what are the open source equivalents of those. So when you look at the enterprise, there's huge focus on deployment frequency, right? On the open source side, you're generally not in a like CD context, continuous deployment. You're not pushing new versions to, say Maven Central every evening. Some projects do, but generally it's more version release oriented. But how frequently do those version releases come out, right? So release frequency. Organizational performance on the enterprise, things like profitability and agility and ability to enter new markets. Those are prized in that setting. On the open source side, we went to popularity as sort of a primary metric, right? You write open source code to improve the world, for people to use it, incorporate it into their applications, and provide value, right? And so popularity is a great measure of that. And then mean time to restore service is a very important operational metric on the enterprise side. When you have an outage, when you have a security vulnerability, how long does it take you to respond? You have the same thing in open source, right? Where a CVE comes out in, say, a dependency of an open source project, and now you need to go and fix that dependency to use a new version to remediate the issue. How long does that take? So we measured all of these, and we went into this work with several hypotheses about what we would find. And so really our ultimate goal was to either find evidence in support of these hypotheses or refute them, right? And so hypothesis one was projects that release more frequently will have better outcomes, right? It's sort of this faster is better mantra that we see a lot, certainly across the DevOps space. That's a big component of DevOps, release frequently. If something's hard, do it more, that sort of thing. Will we see the same thing when it comes to open source? And we do. So we see that projects that release more frequently were 2.5 times more popular. So they're better in terms of those outcomes that are important. They have 1.4 times larger development teams. This is a good place to mention that this is, we're measuring correlations here. There's not a causation component to this. So we can't say whether the larger development teams allow them to release more frequently, or whether developers see the project releasing frequently and see that activity and then are drawn to contribute to the project because of that. We don't know exactly which way it goes. But they also attract greater foundation fund, or they're associated with greater foundation funding. Again, we don't know which way the causation goes. Hypothesis two was that projects that update dependencies more frequently will be more secure, right? And there's good reason to believe this might be the case. Certainly, if you're going to remediate a security vulnerability, you have a dependency that some CVE comes out against it, you have to release a new version to update that dependency. So sort of update cadence provides the capacity to stay up to date with security vulnerabilities. But then you have the choice of, do you actually address vulnerabilities with each release or not? And what we see is that generally projects do, right? If they're releasing more frequently, some of that release capacity goes towards addressing security issues. So the projects that update dependencies more frequently, they just release more frequently in general. They have a 530 times faster median time to update. So when a dependency of theirs releases a new version, they're much, much faster to respond to that version. They're less likely to have out-of-date dependencies. And then as a result of all of these, they're more secure as well. And this is important, I should say, you know, I'm sort of mixing here like update velocity with security remediation, you know, and saying, you know, that this is sort of all about updating quickly is important and sort of correlated with being more secure. But they are sort of different things, except that if you think about it, often security vulnerabilities are discovered or reported after the fact, right? And Prime Faces is a great example of that, this CV here at the bottom. It was published in 2018, but the vulnerability actually occurred much earlier. It was fixed in an intermediate version of the code. And so if you stayed up to date, you know, with that project continually, you wouldn't be vulnerable when the CV was reported. It's only if you're falling behind that you are. And so, you know, staying up to date, you never know when, you know, an old version of software will have some vulnerability discovered against it. All right, so look for, you know, projects that release frequently. If you're trying to think about what, you know, open source project to use, look for projects that release frequently, projects with larger, more active development teams, projects with foundation support. Like this, you know, this all makes sense, right? These seem like good things to have. But the first thing that people often look for is popularity. And so we're going to get to that in a second. You know, popularity, like popularity is missing from this, right? Should look for more popular projects. What about that? Well, stay tuned. All right, so hypothesis 3 was that projects with fewer dependencies will stay more up to date. Like that seems to make sense, right? You have less to keep track of, so it's easier to stay up to date with it. That actually wasn't the case. We actually found projects with more dependencies were also better at keeping those dependencies up to date. And so that's, let me go back there. That's, you know, sort of, we were like, why is that? That seems weird. We dug in a bit and found actually projects with more dependencies also tend to have larger development teams. And so, you know, perhaps that gives them the capacity to devote some resources to keeping those dependencies up to date, right? Or, like I said, this is correlation, not causation. Maybe each of those developers brings their favorite library, and that's how you end up with this explosion of dependencies. Anyway, interesting correlation. Not sure what more to say about that. But hypothesis 4, I think, is really interesting. So I mentioned that popularity is missing from that, you know, what to look for in a project. And the reason is we went in thinking that popularity would be, you know, an important predictor of security and update cadence. It was not. So there were plenty of projects that were popular with extremely poor time to updates, extremely poor update behavior. Popularity did not really correlate at all with mean time to update. So more popular projects were not necessarily more likely to stay up to date. And that was really surprising because, you know, we found a lot of correlations in the data. You know, there were a lot of things that were associated with, you know, larger development teams provide, you know, more of this and, you know, more update capacity, more ability to deal with dependencies. You know, we saw all these correlations between different attributes that we were looking at. Popularity and update performance was one that was missing, which was very surprising. So the most popular projects were not statistically different from others with respect to update behavior. So we recommend really going beyond popularity and considering other things when you're choosing components. All right, so so that's great. Choose components that update more regularly. That seems good. But then what we find is that a lot of companies, a lot of teams, even if they're choosing projects that update frequently, they don't stay current with those updates. They're not pulling those updates in all the time. And so why is that? Why doesn't everyone stay up to date, right? On the open source side or on the enterprise side, why doesn't everyone just keep all their dependencies up to date? And part of the reason is breaking changes, right? An update of a dependency is not always a smooth process. And so there was a study on this, you know, sort of why and how do Java developers break APIs and deal with broken APIs. They found that across a 116-day period, looking at 400 real-world Java projects, during this time, 802 possible breaking changes were detected, which is quite a high percentage of breaking changes. So we asked some questions about this. This sort of inspired some part of the survey that we asked to enterprise users of open source. And we asked really about their update, their perception of update pain, right? So how painful do they find the process of updating? And really use that to divide them into high, medium, and low pain clusters. And what we found was that the cluster that that had low pain, they found dependencies 3.5. They were 3.2 times less likely to agree that updating dependencies is painful. And what's interesting is the set of practices that were associated with the people in that cluster, right? So what was associated with low update pain? Well, scheduling updating dependencies, like making it an explicit part of the work process, using the latest version or close to the latest version of dependencies. They were 6.2 times more likely to do that. Having some process to add a new dependency, they were 11 times more likely to have process around choosing dependencies. And so that gets to sort of how do you evaluate, how do you approve these dependencies, and what are you considering? And so, I think that connects back to what I was saying about popularity, maybe not the only component to consider, but update performance and size of development team and foundation support were much more predictive of good outcomes there. And then having a process to proactively remove problematic dependencies. This is something that people frequently don't do that can be extremely helpful. And then having automated tools. So this was the biggest change, actually, 12 times more likely to use automated tools to track and manage dependencies. That can make a big difference in terms of knowing when an update is available, knowing if it's going to be difficult to update that dependency. Tools can help you do all of that. All right, so I have some examples here of, what do we see when it comes to update behaviors? And this is really interesting. So this is data on users migrating from one version of a dependency to another, and what sort of jumps are they making? So we see an arc, there's an arc here whenever we see someone upgrading from one version of dependency to another. And so the larger arcs, the higher ones are large jumps in terms of inversion space, right? You're jumping ahead many, many versions. And what's interesting, so I want to highlight a few patterns, because this comes to the question of like, how do you choose dependencies, right? What should you think about? What difference can it make to choose sort of one dependency versus another? And it comes down to, well, these are some of the outcomes, right? So we looked at the Hibernate library. What's interesting here is there's a big sort of disconnect, a void in the middle there that corresponds in this case to a major version change. And so, I think what this is likely indicative of is, some sort of update pain around that point, right? It's difficult to go from versions on the left half to versions in the right half, or left 2/3, the right third, I guess. And so, you'd like to avoid that, right? If you want to stay up to date, you want to know that, you'll be able to get new features without having to change your code quite a bit. This next one is the Spring framework. So I think this is interesting because there is a lot of upgrade activity, but what you'll notice here is there's also these really big arcs, these really big jumps. And so this indicates that, there's quite a few people who are staying on one version for a while and then just waiting and upgrading, several versions, many, many versions forward, which maybe indicates that, it requires some amount of planning. It's not, it's not for free, but it's maybe not quite as bad as that other example where there's a complete disconnect in the middle. And then here is an example of, where it's just really easy, right? So Jota time, you see people jumping back and forth across all versions here, which is, I think the ideal. All right, so then the last thing I want to talk about is some work we did focused on the consumer side. So when you look at enterprises that use open source, what do we see there? And really this question of, can you have it all, right? Can enterprises be both fast and secure in their use of open source? And the result is yes. So we did a huge survey. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to go into sort of all the details. It's in the report if you want to look at that. But we asked about security outcomes and practices at large enterprises. And what we found is sort of 4 clusters. There's we sort of divided these on 2 axes. We combined all the different attributes, all the different survey questions into measures of productivity and measures of risk management outcomes. And we found there was sort of a cluster that was security first, very focused on security, great risk management outcomes, but at the cost of productivity. There was the group in the upper right here that were very high performing and had good security practices. So these are sort of, that's where you want to be, right? In the upper right, you're getting sort of that's the group that has it all. And then the lower right, there's the group that's focused on productivity, sort of at the cost of security. And then in the lower left, you're just not getting either, right? So that you don't want to be in the lower left. And so we thought about it and we were like, what is it that's separating these groups, right? And in particular, we looked first at the high performers versus security first, right? So both of these groups they're achieving good security outcomes, but one is doing it in a very agile, very productive way, and the other is doing it in sort of a slower cadence. And what we found is that the high-performing group was 59% more likely to be using software composition analysis tools. So that's important. They were more likely to automate their approval, management, and analysis of dependencies. And they're more likely to enforce governance policies in CI, so centralizing governance, more likely to maintain software bills of materials, and 96 times more likely to centrally scan all deployed artifacts for security and license compliance. So it's really this visibility, this use of tools and automation to give you sort of continual access to information about your applications and their dependencies. And then we looked across the high performers and the low performers, what separates them. And here we found, first of all, the high performers had much faster frequency, much more frequent deployments. They were much faster at detecting vulnerable components. They were able to remediate components more quickly. And then they actually had some interesting productivity outcomes, like 5.7 times less time required for developers to switch from one team to another. And again, I think it's all about this, having some sort of process, some sort of structure around dependency management, some sort of consistency across the enterprise. And then they were much faster at approving new open source dependencies. And actually, if you look, this is the centroids of these groups. The high performers, it's not clear from the earlier clustering, but if I draw it this way, you can see they actually had slightly higher productivity outcomes than even the productivity first group. So, really, yeah, you can have it all. You can have better risk management outcomes, higher developer productivity. And interestingly enough, they had improved job satisfaction as well. So the last thing I want to talk about is open source enlightenment. This is like, it's a collection of questions we asked around, a company's open source practices. Do they upstream commits? Do they contribute back to the community? And so what we found was, interestingly, things like support for open source, involvement in open source communities, this set of attributes that we rolled up to this open source enlightenment score, they actually led to higher job satisfaction and better security outcomes. So, there really is benefit to being involved in these open source communities, not just taking libraries and applications and using them, but contributing back as well. So you can be faster, more secure, happier, you can have it all, if you take the right approach. If you want to see more details on how to do that, go download the report. It has full information on sort of all of our findings and recommendations. And then we're always looking for additional hypotheses to test, anecdotes, how do you choose components in your organization? What components are easy? What sort of updates are easy? What's hard? What's causing you pain? This research is a collaborative activity. I'm not here just to report on what we've been doing. I want to work together on new studies and new investigations. So, hit me up in the chat, email me, find me on Twitter. I'm happy to talk more about this. Thank you.